Hey there, what's going on? It's Dr. Mike Nelson, and welcome back to the Flex Diet podcast, where we talk about all things to increase lean body mass, performance, and do it all without destroying your health in the process. And today is just a solo cast with me, and I'm going to go over some of my notes and all the great things I learned at the International Society of Sports Nutrition Conference. Happened 2 weeks ago in June down in sunny and very hot and humid Florida. So the podcast today is brought to you by the Flex Diet certification. So if you want more information on the Flex Diet, which is 8 different interventions that are designed to increase your ability to recover via primary nutrition. It covers everything from protein, fats, carbohydrates, NEAT, which is non-exercise activity thermogenesis, walking around, moving, exercise, sleep, micronutrition, fasting, and more. To learn all about it, go to flexdiet.com, flexdiet.com. You'll be able to get on the wait list for the next time that it opens up. And not sure exactly when that'll be. Probably not for a couple months yet. But when you get on the wait list, you will also be entered into the daily newsletter. Has lots of great free information. I sent out some information about the conference there already too. So go to flexdiet.com for all the information. So, as I mentioned, this was the 19th annual ISSN conference, Fort Lauderdale Beach, Florida. It was June 16th through the 18th, 2022. So you want to make sure to head down there for the 20th annual ISSN conference next year. I think the first ISSN conference I went to was, I want to say 2009, 2008, I think. I've been honored to speak there a few times. First time I did there was 2011, talking about metabolic flexibility. So it's been great to go to the conference most years. Awesome to see tons of wonderful people again. Just a real great information, awesome group of people too. First up on the talk was Dr. Guillermo Escalante with the science and application of fasted versus fed cardio for fat loss. So if you're following me on the old Instagram there, which is just Dr. Mike T. Nelson, I put up a post about this with some of the slides from his talk, and I thought he did a really good job. Because anytime you mention the words fasted cardio, it still brings up a lot of debate. So the real preface is, for people who are new, that if you're doing cardiovascular training, and this is in the context for body composition or fat loss, it is true that fasted cardio at a low to moderate state in most people, again, there's a huge amount of variability here, but in most people, it will use more fat as a fuel source. So that part is 100% true in terms of the kind of fat burning zone. Now the caveat and where it gets very confusing is, does that necessarily lead to more fat loss and better body composition? Again, my bias is I think that it can, but it's definitely not at the top thing to do. Obviously, calories are still going to matter here. Sleep, exercise, recovery, all of those things are going to come into the picture. I think doing your cardio training fasted is probably farther down on the list. However, my biased opinion is if you've got everything else in check, I do have clients do fasted cardio. Now, another caveat there is that this is also normally much easier to do. You get up, put your shoes on, maybe go for an easy walk, run, get on the bike, do some rowing, whatever it is you want to do. You don't really need to do anything beforehand, right? Because usually you'll get a lot of questions of, What do I eat beforehand? What supplement do I consume? What type of warm-up do I need to do? How slow do I need to start out? Pretty much don't have to worry about any of those things with fasted cardio. You just get up and go do it. So I also think that it does make it easier. In terms of, is it more advantageous? Dr. Guillermo did a really great talk, and the data is pretty split. There's some data showing it might be beneficial, some data showing that it probably doesn't matter all that much and didn't show a huge benefit. And his takeaway, which I would agree with, is if you're general population and just getting into doing cardio, just go do it. Don't really worry about if it's fasted or not. If you're a physique competitor and you've got everything else dialed in and you're really trying to get at those last few percentage, his opinion was it might matter. And again, we don't have any data in physique competitors or even higher level athletes at this point. But I would agree with them that at that point, it probably does matter. And my last bias in this area is I do think it might be beneficial for increasing health. If you can upregulate your body's use of fat as a fuel, which will help the one end of metabolic flexibility. There's a fair amount of data now showing that from a health perspective, that is going to be a great thing. So how I think about it in my head is I think most of the time for exercise in general, we just think about burning calories. And I like to think of it as what is the performance and the adaptation that we primarily want from exercise. So if you're lifting weights, do you want to get stronger? Do you want to add hypertrophy? Do you want to do a combination of both? And then for cardiovascular training, I think of it from what type of aerobic adaptations do we want? Because remember, aerobic base, your aerobic metabolism, is going to determine your overall energy, your ability to recover from one session to the next, and even intra-session. So from one set to the next set. And that I like thinking of adaptation again and performance. In terms of calories, I like the lower intensity stuff. So if your goal is primarily body composition, then I think fasted low intensity cardio would fit in here. So would walking and just general NEAT. So those are things that you can do a fair amount of. They're not extremely energy intensive. And the key part is that they don't seem to upregulate appetite. Some very interesting data on high intensity intervals, and it's a little bit split, but most of it I would say is pushing towards that if you do more higher intensity work, it does tend to upregulate appetite. Now again, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but if you're really trying to control calories, what I've noticed in clients is that sometimes that can make it quite difficult. So I like to think about, can we sneak more calories out of the system without triggering that appetite effect? So if we have our weight training in place for the adaptations we want, maybe strength, power, hypertrophy, we've got some cardiovascular training in for the aerobic adaptations, and then we may add in things to sneak more calories out of the system. This would primarily be walking, your step count, and potentially fasted cardio in some clients. So analogy I was given to someone else on a call the other day was if you're an unethical, say, operator of a cash business or a cash till, how much can you sort of skim illegally off of the top without the owner really noticing, right? If you get too greedy, yes, you got more money out, but you probably got caught. If you're just sneaking a small amount out, but you can do that day in and day out, you'll probably end up with a higher amount, right? So we want to sneak as many calories out of the system as we can without potentially upregulating appetite. So again, those are all my biases there. So the next talk we had was Moza Rosen, I believe I pronounced that correct. NAD, muscle and athletic performance, current research, and future needs. So NAD is one of the molecules that is used in energy production pathways. Right now, the two main supplements that are promoted to increase it is a supplement called NR and also MNN. Those are acronyms, but both of those are in the NAD pathway, and in theory, supplementing them may increase NAD, which may increase energy. So her talk was sponsored by Chromadex. They make an NR supplement, and it was interesting. It's something I've been kind of sort of watching off and on now for several years. And her conclusion was that it might be beneficial, but the current research in terms of performance, it just isn't a lot of performance studies on it. So my assertion was, if this is increasing energy production and those pathways, at some point we should expect that it would be what's called an ergogenic aid for exercise. It'd be something as a supplemental form that would increase exercise performance. Unfortunately, I haven't really seen a ton of data on that, and the data right now in exercising populations just isn't a whole lot. So her main takeaway was we should be looking at this as something that may be an ergogenic aid, and I would 100% agree with that. As of this recording, I'm probably going to do my little NR experiment. I bought a bunch of it. The downside right now is that both of the compounds, NR and MN, are quite expensive still. Granted, the price has been coming down, but they are expensive. And to the credit of Chromadex, who does have a patent on NR, they have done a lot of studies for many, many years on it, and those studies are not cheap to run. So if you are one of the producers of it, it's costing you a lot of money in order to sponsor a lot of the research. So I understand why it currently is more expensive. Even supplements like creatine monohydrate, back when they first came out, were also crazy expensive. But over time now, creatine is very inexpensive compared to what it used to be. So personally, again, this is not recommended for anybody else. I'm going to try taking 1,500 to 2,000 milligrams of NR per day. And I'll probably run that for, I think, about enough for 6 to 8 weeks and see if I notice any difference. This would be self-reported energy, heart rate variability, heart rate, and any performance data that I can get. And I'll keep you updated on what the results are. I'd be super curious if anyone has used either one and what you found. I know in some places you can get an infusion of NAD directly via an IV. I have not done that. Downside there is I've heard that it can be quite painful. It takes a while. We have even less data on that, and it's also very expensive. But I know some people who have used it, and the anecdotal reports have generally been positive. So something I think to keep an eye out on for in the future. Next talk was Dr. Scott Forbes talking about creatine and cognition. So I'm working to get Dr. Scott on the podcast, was able to hang out with him again, which was awesome. So again, make sure to follow all of his stuff on Instagram. He's got great things. And creatine, as we know for muscle, has been shown to be effective to increase performance. But it also may have cognition effects too, because creatine is at the base of energy production. And on this podcast, you can listen to another one I did with Dr. Eric Ralston. We went really deep down in creatine and cognition. And a lot of what he said matched what Dr. Scott Forbes said also, that creatine looks like it has very interesting potential for cognition and for brain health. The downside is for human subject studies, we don't have a ton of data. We don't really know exactly how much dosing we would need to maximize creatine stores in the brain. It's probably going to be much higher than muscle. I know just based off some of the work I've read from both those researchers, I've speculated that it might be 10 to 20 grams per day if you're using it for more of a neuroprotective effect or cognition. But we don't really know. There's very, very limited data on that. Part of this is there's no good way other than some invasive work, such as using technology like MRS and other technologies, to try to get at how much creatine is in the brain. With muscle, we can go in and use the old Bergstrom needle and take out a chunk of muscle from tissue and we can analyze it and we can do chemical things to it. With the brain, we can't really do that. So we're left with some non-invasive imaging, which can give us hints. We're left with animal studies. The downside with animal studies is that it appears our little rodent friends, the mice and rats, I can't remember which. I apologize. I get them mixed up all the time, so I'm not a mice or rat researcher. So people send me all sorts of hate mail for it, I'm sure. But they appear to store creatine in their brain at much higher rates than humans. So initially I was all excited about some of the rodent data that looked at reduction in TBIs in a group of little furry guys that had creatine and the group that did not. Unfortunately for the mice in the study, they both got whacked on the head with a set amount of force to induce a TBI. The one group of little rodents got creatine, the other group did not. The group that got creatine did much better. The downside with that is you figured out we won't be able to do a randomized controlled trial creating TBIs in humans. No IRB is ever going to pass that, and for good reason. And we can't sacrifice the humans and look at their brain. So we're left with non-invasive methods. And the creatine uptake in humans is also, or appears to be, quite different. But overall, I thought his talk was really good. I do think this is a very fascinating area of research, and hopefully we will learn a lot more about it in the near future. Next up was Wendy Earlbrecht. It's an MSRD LD. Practical applications for fueling today's young athletes. And it was a really good talk to have some nice practical advice. And my big takeaway from it was, and I'm guilty of this too, for general populations, and she works with a lot of younger athletes too, we have to keep in mind that just like with weight training, we want to start off with wherever they're at and give them things that are effective, but also simple. All right, so my little catchphrase is that physiology is complex, but your actions should be relatively simple. So as coaches and trainers, you're translating for clients. You're going to conferences like this, listening to fun podcasts like this, and taking that information and making it useful to your clients. So I thought she did a really good job of presenting things that were helpful, lots of case studies. And the takeaway was that most of the information that these athletes were doing it was correct, but it was nothing earth-shattering. And that's not a knock at all. That's what we actually need, because the end goal is to make it practical so that people can actually do it so that they can get the benefits from it. Once they've been doing that and you want to make things a little bit more complicated and add steps, then by all means. But most people, when they start, don't need a checklist of 17 things to do by Monday. They need you to figure out what is the highest leverage, the things that are going to get the most result with the least amount of effort, maximize those first, and then move down from there. And shameless self-promotion, that's how I created the Flex Diet Cert. So the interventions in there, the higher leverage items are near the front part of the course, so that you would start on those to get clients moving in the right direction. Next up was acetylcholine, a potent brain health nutrient and nootropic. This is by Atakito Numashara. I hope I pronounced his name correct. And acetylcholine is something I've followed for quite a while. I've actually recommended it to be used for different formulations that I've done with companies in the past. It has a lot of really good data. It's been around for a while. So like I said, there's very good human data in it. The big takeaway here is as a nootropic, so something that may enhance cognition or sort of mental performance. As little as 250 milligrams can increase attention. And they were also looking at studies in kids aged 13 to 18, looking at 250 or 500 milligrams per day. And on different metrics, such as a TAP test, they did see an improvement, which I thought was pretty interesting because a lot of the data on acetylcholine or CDP choline is in older people. So one of the big questions was, is it beneficial in a healthier population? Most of the data I've seen would say yes. And then the next question is it beneficial in a younger population? And some of the data they presented would say yes. So acetylcholine, one thing to look out for. It is, if you are listening to this and you do formulations, I got to see my buddy Vince again, who was awesome. You can listen to the podcast here that we did from him. He used to be one of the main PhD formulator guys at Onnit back in the day. So I got to see him and chat with all different things with him. But if you are using CDP choline, they do enforce the patent, and for good reason. They spent a lot of money on it. So the raw material is still a little bit more on the expensive side. But in terms of things that are beneficial that you can put sometimes in beverages or especially in powders that are efficacious, that do have a lot of data, also GRAS status, so generally regarded as safe, CDP choline is one I would put near the top of the list. Next up was astaxanthin as a dietary tool for exercise training. This is by Dr. Karen Hecht. This was sponsored by AstraReal. So again, astaxanthin is one of those compounds I've been following for quite some time. Oh God, probably going on 13 years now. Actually, I first saw it for eye muscle fatigue at the ISSN conference, like many, many years ago. And the thought process there was astaxanthin is this red-colored carotenoid. So if you've ever seen like crabs, it is the red coloring in them. It's also used as a dye in salmon that are farm-raised. So salmon that are farm-raised aren't really pinky colored at all. The flesh is actually this weird white-looking color, and it looks weird. So astaxanthin has been approved as a color additive for salmon. And that's because the salmon aren't eating the same food that they would before, so their flesh doesn't get colored that way. So astaxanthin, as I mentioned, is a very interesting antioxidant. It doesn't appear to kind of readily spin off a lot of pro-oxidants, which is interesting. It appears to have these weird kind of fat and potentially water-soluble characteristics to it. That part's probably been a little bit debated. And as I said, initially I saw it with eye fatigue. And the reason that it seemed to help with that is that the muscles around the eye are highly oxidative, and they're working a lot because they have to do these very small movements all the time during the day. So they're kind of on all of the time. And astaxanthin was theorized to reduce some of the sort of oxidants that these working eye muscles were producing, and that could help performance. There's some very interesting older data, again, in our rodent friends about some pretty massive increases in aerobic performance with astaxanthin. And the way that it worked there was possible changes to something called CPT1. CPT1 is carnitine palmitate transferase 1. It is one of the little guys you need to get fat into the mitochondria to be used as a better fuel. So if you can get and run more fat through the mitochondria at a faster rate, you can increase submax exercise performance. And in theory, this might be beneficial also for fat loss and body composition, potentially treating other diseases. So in the study, they showed some pretty big changes in rodent endurance performance. And I tried it at that time, and I've tried it with different athletes in the past. And unfortunately, a lot of the human data, at least in terms of exercise performance, is still pretty mixed. They presented some data showing performance increases in some studies, which was interesting. Some of the other studies are still kind of mixed. And at least in terms of the effect size that we saw in our rodent friends, that big of an effect size hasn't been shown in humans. But still very interesting. It's one of those compounds that I keep trying to stay on top of the research as best that I can. They presented some new data there that over 70 plus studies have been conducted on it. Benefits of 2 to 12 milligrams per day. 6 milligram per day dose saw an increase of glutathione by 7%. They had another group where they had supplemented at 4 milligrams per day with training. And they saw that the squat, in terms of number of reps that were completed, was increased. And then they also looked at changes in CRP. So CRP is C-reactive protein. It's a pretty decent rough marker of inflammation in the body. It's probably a little bit of a oversimplification, but it's one of the markers you can get on a blood panel. And in that study, the one group taking astaxanthin didn't really see much of any change in their CRP. The other group saw a 57% increase in CRP. So it looks like you may be able to get a slight exercise performance benefit. That's probably still debatable, but maybe you can do it at a lower cost, that your body is producing less inflammation overall. Again, we do need some local inflammation for the responses that we want, and that is kind of a triggering effect of these signaling molecules. But we don't want inflammation to go absolutely rampant throughout the entire body either. The nice part is astaxanthin has come down in price quite a bit. It used to be quite expensive. Right now, it's even gone down even more in price. And just in a private conversation I had with them, the brand, I think it's Doublewood on Amazon, was selling Astroreal like ridiculously cheap. So I stocked up on a couple bottles. Again, I don't have any affiliation with any of the companies here, at least that I know of. I don't have any affiliation with them. Maybe by the time you're listening to this, that won't be true. But yeah, so I thought if you're looking at it, that may be a good source, and go from there. Next up, we had The Science of Cannabidiol by Helena Yardley. She's a PhD. She works for the Canopy Growth Company or Corporation. And CBD, again, is one of those things I've been following probably for like the last 5 years or so, maybe 6 years now. Right in this Department of Agriculture 2018 changed the ag bill and said that if you're using hemp, which they defined as basically cannabis or marijuana, that is under 0.03% THC, so very, very little THC, that it is considered a supplement and not necessarily regulated as a Scheduled 1 compound. So cannabis and THC are currently, as of the recording, at least at a federal level in the United States, they are considered a Scheduled 1 drug. So a Scheduled 1 drug means that there is no medical use for it, and there is an extremely high risk of potential addiction. So cannabis doesn't really belong in that category at all. There's been medical preparations of cannabis that have been approved for quite some time. Marinol is one of the earlier versions in the 90s, which is literally just THC. So THC is technically delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol. That is the psychoactive component in cannabis or marijuana. We also have CBD approved as a drug under the name Epidiolex. There's also other preparations such as Sativex. So we have these different preparations that are approved as drugs, which by definition you would think would violate the Schedule 1, but they've got kind of an interesting legal workaround there. So since 2018, you can buy CBD, cannabidiol, as a supplement. So the two main cannabinoids in cannabis are THC and CBD, so cannabidiol. THC is really the only one that is psychoactive. Some of the other ones in very high amounts, maybe, but THC is the main one. And then there's all a host of other compounds. There's well over 100 different cannabinoids that have been identified so far. CBL, CBN. You'll see a lot more from CBG. She mentioned that in her talk. The main reason for that is it's easiest to extract. So the main issue with a lot of these other cannabinoids is the expense it's going to take to extract them. So at the end of the day, right, the company has to make money. So the next cannabidiol, I think, or I shouldn't say that, but I should say the next big cannabinoid that you'll C is probably going to be CBG. Now, again, that may or may not necessarily be for the data behind it, but probably because it's going to be the easiest to extract. CBN, you're seeing some stuff with that now for sleep. I was asking her about that, and there's a little bit of data. Most of it's kind of anecdotal right now. I did some N-of-1 and just some testing of it. I was thinking about producing a supplement that was primarily CBN. Again, just based on my preliminary testing and the fact that there isn't a lot of testing for sleep, I kind of decided against it, which is probably not doing my pocketbook any favors because I'm sure it'll probably be super popular right now. But, yeah, whatever. That's life. And I'm okay with that. Again, it might be useful. Safety data on it looks to be pretty good. And as CBN is also starting to come down in price now. So it's at the point where you probably could do it as a supplement and still make money on it, again, depending on your sourcing of that. So our talk was really good. I talked about CBD and pain relief, and that CBD, she said, is best described as kind of a normalizer. So if we back up and we think about the endocannabinoid system, this is a system that, I mean, for all the freaking physiology that I've taken, I don't even think we mentioned it more than like in passing. It's like, oh, yeah, it's a thing. And next topic. It turns out that the CBN or CBD, THC, these are all cannabinoids that interact with the body's endocannabinoid system. So your body itself produces its own cannabinoids. So anandamide is one of the cannabinoids your body is endogenously or producing within itself. So the endocannabinoid system plays just all sorts of roles in physiology. So you can kind of think of it as a little bit more of the fine tuning system to your body and to your nervous system. So she described CBD as more of a, quote, normalizer. Other things that she said that I'm looking here. Yeah, the data on it was pretty mixed. And she did a really good job of giving the presentation of kind of the overview of just cannabis and CBD and cannabinoids and what's going on. The other part, too, is that a lot of CBD products are way underdosed, right? So a couple milligrams of CBD, probably really not going to do anything. I know there's some limited data showing that very small amounts might be beneficial. I would say maybe. Typically, doses probably need to be in the hundreds of milligrams to be effective. And we haven't quite sorted out who these may be effective for. So I've tried CBD and recommended it to different clients. I've used up to 300 to 400 mgs on myself just to see what would happen. And my conclusion is I think it can be beneficial for some people. So for sleep, I've had a few people report that it made a huge difference for their sleep. And other people said, didn't really do a whole lot. I've done some testing with Omega Wave looking at something called a DC potential to try to get at direct brain function. CBD appears to help DC potential, but not every time. I could still brutalize myself in the gym, do a lot of speed and power stuff, and CBD wasn't going to completely normalize that. But as far as I could tell, it appeared to have a beneficial effect. So, like all things, I think we need more research in that area, especially in the terms of sports nutrition. There isn't as much data there. Doses probably need to be higher. And then I really don't trust many CBD manufacturers at all because the expense in a lot of it is things that you don't necessarily see in the background. So the testing, where did you get it from? How do you extract it? Are you actually even putting the amount of CBD in the bottle that you say is on the label? Are you making sure there's not high amounts of THC or over 0.03% THC? You can look up, there's several things now where they've done testing on CBD products, and many of them do not meet label claim, and many of them do have other components in there that are not supposed to be in there. Again, right now as this is recording, I do some affiliate work for Charlotte's Web through Driven Nutrition. They'll put a link in the notes if people are interested in that. I've toured the facility over 2 days in the past. Awesome people, like really top-notch facility. And they have tracking on all of their products. So you can scan a little QR code, you can get the lot number, and you can see exactly the COA and all of the information that goes into it. Again, to do all of that is expensive. And companies that are doing it the right way, in general, will be more than happy to explain what they're doing because it is a significant expense to them, and they're happy to show customers what they're doing. So if you have questions about your CBD product, I would recommend you contact them directly and just ask them, those basic questions. And, companies that are legit usually are, like I said, more than happy to help show you what they're doing in that area. And next up, we had a great talk from Dr. Kirk Escobar, the evolutionary inertia of weight loss and body recomposition. And what I really liked about his talk was it was very much based in science, but it was also very practical. And some of the takeaways from his talk was that maybe physical activity might actually decrease resting metabolic rate, which I thought was interesting and something I need to probably go back and look up a lot more on that. Resting metabolic rate generally doesn't move around as much as what most people think. And in terms of how humans are expending calories, he had a quote that it's estimated that the more Stone Age human expended about, 1,200, I have here, 1,290 kcals per day. This is in movement. The modern humans are around 555 kcals per day. Again, I would have to look up the exact references on that, but that would make sense to me. If you look around, people just generally don't move as much as they used to. We can look at other supporting data on that from step counts, which have gone down. And we know that just at a lower flux of energy, your body just doesn't work nearly as well. So hint, hint, I've already been working on it for, a year and a half now. There's a book, hopefully, that'll be out maybe later this year, early next year, with more on that concept. In general, your body genetically does not want to add muscle and lose fat, which is true, because your body is set up for efficiency. And if we think back in more of the caveman days, it required a lot of work to go get food. And if you look at different places now that don't have a lot of technology in different tribes, it's a fair amount of energy expended just to get food every day. Where now I can literally hit 2 buttons on this crazy piece of technology called the smartphone, and Chipotle shows up at my door, which I do have to admit is pretty damn amazing. But we can now get food with very, very little movement. And that was not always the case. All right, so remember, your body wants to be as efficient as possible. And it is literally more efficient for you to go through the drive-thru and get 1,200 calories for $3.19, right? Didn't even have to get out of your car. Didn't even cost you much money. Your body is literally wired to do that because it's an efficiency thing, right? So back in the day, starvation was a real thing. The people who did better were people who were more efficient, who could actually take those calories, did not burn them nearly as much, and stored more of them as fat. Right, this gets into the whole thrifty versus non-thrifty metabolism and possibly different genetic markers, etc. Now our environment is flip-flopped. Our environment says, hey, we figured this out, so we'll give you food and we'll make it inexpensive, and the easier we can make it, the more we make, the more we sell, and therefore the issues of where we're at right now. So his result was, if your body genetically does not want to add more muscle and drop fat, what do we need to do? You need to train. You need to exercise. You need to give it a reason for adding more muscle and a reason to burn more calories. Again, I know that seems intrinsically obvious, but adaptation, again, in my opinion, is not something you need to force. It's just something that happens. So you need to focus on providing it the right stimulus. And yeah, there's a bunch of things you can do to kind of mess up the adaptation process. Lack of sleep, low calories, low protein, no micronutrients, etc. But even then, you can't really stop the adaptation process. There were some old studies from the 70s where they put these mice on just a complete overload model, and they used different ways of doing that. One of the ways they did it is something called a synergistic ablation, where they go into the little lower limb of the little buggers and they cut up one of the muscles in the lower limb so that the other muscle has to be active much, much more because it's not getting support from the muscle that they cut. And what they see in this kind of overload model was they could put the little buggers on low protein diet. They did all sorts of things to them. I think they even castrated one of the groups. They dropped all their anabolic hormones. I think they obliterated their thyroid. They did all sorts of horrible things to them. And what they saw is that in that leg, right, because we can compare the one leg to the other leg because they did the synergistic ablation only on one leg. The leg that had it done on still saw big increases in hypertrophy. So again, we don't want to go around cutting part of a muscle to make another one bigger, but we can provide overload via training so that the body has to adapt to that. And if you provide the right stimulus, you are going to get some adaptation. Again, there are things that can slow that down, that can drop that overall rate of adaptation that you get. But I don't think we can drive it to complete zero, right? And so I think that is hopeful for people. Again, another reason that you should train in case you just needed one. Katie Emerson did a talk on New Level, which is spelled NOO capital LVL, non-stimulant nootropic. They did this in, I think it was a group of gamers potentially, if I remember right. Did some different neuro testing from Cambridge Brain Science, and they showed that it did appear to have an increase. So you can look up New Level is a raw material from the company Nutrition 21. And her talk was sponsored by them. Next up, Dr. Jason had a talk on caffeine supplementation. What are the effects of the CYP1A and different genes on paraxanthine and habitual caffeine consumption on resistance exercise and jumping performance? So it was a very good talk. You can look him up on Instagram. I think it's just under Dr. Red Performance, but we'll double check that and put that in the notes. And we know that the CYP1A enzymes, and this can be tested for genetically, affect your rate of caffeine metabolism. So if you look around, you'll see fast and slow metabolizers of caffeine. The reality is it's a spectrum back and forth. And a lot of the newer studies now are subdividing people by genetically. Are you more on the fast metabolizer or are you on the slow metabolizer side? And maybe we will get different effects with different amounts of caffeine in these different people. And his study, which I think they have not published yet or just passed review, they looked at 27 men who did resistance training. They gave them a 5 milligram per kg caffeine dose. And they were looking at the downstream metabolism of paraxanthine. So paraxanthine is one of the main downstream metabolites of caffeine. And as a side note, if you listen to my podcast that I did on ISSN last year, paraxanthine may be a new supplement. It has, I think it may have GRAS status right now, and I know there's more research in that area. Again, the supplement industry is always looking for new and safe stimulants. When I first heard about this from Dr. Ralph Yeager, I wanted to smack my head against the wall because I assumed that back in the day when they found this out, that paraxanthine was investigated as effects on its own. It appears it really hasn't, which is kind of surprising how we can just skip a whole area of research. Again, there was some data, but really not that much. So that might be something to look for. You can listen to the podcast from last year on that. But in Dr. Jason, his study, they looked at the fast metabolizers and saw that they did have more paraxanthine versus slow metabolizers. And so I asked him a question about if we could give people paraxanthine directly as a supplement, would that be beneficial for fast or slow metabolizers? And we don't know on that yet, but I think that might be something that may be interesting. If we're using a downstream metabolite, would that be beneficial if you are a fast or slow metabolizer of caffeine? So stay tuned for more on that. And if you want a kind of one-stop shop of all things caffeine related, we'll put a link in the notes to the ISSN position stand on caffeine, which was updated, I believe it's last year. I should know. I was like the third author on it, or fourth author. I don't know. I can't remember anymore. But massive amount of work to do that one. I think that took me like on and off for like 3 years, which I've lost a lot of hair over it. But open access, you can go through. It's broken down by all the different areas where caffeine may be beneficial. So if you want a one-stop shop on caffeine that is still relatively up to date, you can look that one up. You'll also find an older one from the ISSN position stand on energy drinks. So I was a contributing author on that one also. Next up, the effects of citrus flavonoids on exercise performance. This is from Yela Stevens. And this was sponsored by BioActor. So they have a specific citrobioflavonoid. You can look up WATTSUP. So WATTSUP. And they did show that over 4 weeks, they did see an increase in average power in the supplement group. So it'll be, I think, interesting to see over time, is this something we're going to find more data on? What are the effects on that? But if you're looking for other supplements that appear to be grass safe, that are food based, that may be one to check out. And that was also sponsored by BioActor. All right. So the rest of these might be a little bit shorter. The next one was anthocyanin-rich supplementation, potential for sport and exercise, from Dr. Mark Wilhelms. This one was primarily on black currant, specifically New Zealand black currant. And some very interesting data showing that this may have an effect of increasing the use of fat as a fuel source. And I was not aware of this, to be honest. He posted up a study that they did, which looked at using black currant, so 2 capsules for 7 days. Again, I would have to go back and see. I don't think I have the dose on that written down. And cycling at 2 hours, around 65% of VO2 max, they saw an increase of 22% in the use of fat as a fuel. So if you read studies, 22%, that's a large amount, especially for something that is a non-stimulant based. And it appears that a different lab was able to replicate that. I think when they replicated it, it was an increase of around 11%, if my notes are correct here. So still pretty significant, done in 2 separate labs. And I have a note here. Looks like I'd have to go back and double check the amount per day. So very interesting. We'll try to link to the studies there so you can read them yourself. In a private conversation I had with him, he was saying that there's some data on matcha tea also increasing fat oxidation. So something to look for. It appears that the compounds in the New Zealand version are better than other compounds from other countries. So they don't know exactly what subcomponent it is or combination of components. So keep an eye out for that right now. I think it's very interesting and something I'm going to try to test on my own, since I'm one of those goons that has their own metabolic cart, so I can do at least a couple N of one or N of a few studies on that too. So keep an eye out for that. Next up was the dose response effects of arachidonic acid on primary human skeletal myoblasts. This is from Dr. Brandon Roberts. You can find a podcast I did in previous with Dr. Brandon Roberts, so it was always good to see him again. Fortunately, I didn't get a chance to talk to him too much, but got to talk to him a fair amount last year at the President's Dinner, and you can listen to the podcast that we did also. He gave an update in the podcast, we talked about some of the NSAID findings that they were looking at. And the military was super interested in this because if they were giving NSAIDs to people like after heavy exercise during boot camp, were they increasing their risk or potentially decreasing the risk, or was it neutral? So he gave a brief update on that. And I think they're still working to wrap that up. They'll probably publish most of those results, so stay tuned for that. But a lot of these projects, just to give people an idea of the scope, so the one that he was helping with was a 5-year project with a price tag of around $7 million. So these are very large studies, multiple sub-studies within it, looking at both mechanisms and actual human studies. In terms of arachidonic acid, if people are listening, arachidonic acid has been promoted as a supplement. You can look up something called X Factor from Bill Llewellyn. That's going back many years now. The first time I heard of that, I thought it was batshit crazy and made no sense to me, because all my training said that arachidonic acid was this bad guy and was going to dramatically increase, inflammation. And some of the early work said that if you wanted the muscle building effects from it, you would need to limit fish oils. And so that kind of freaked me out a little bit. But the data that's been presented so far doesn't really show that at least arachidonic acid as a supplement is having real big negative effects. The takeaway here is that maybe one of the studies dosed it at 1.5 grams per day and saw about a 5% increase in lean body mass. Some of the other studies showed about a 3% increase in lean body mass. And again, not all the human subjects studies agreed with each other either. So my takeaway on it from a lot of the great data that he presented was maybe, I don't know. I'm still kind of on the fence with that. I guess if you're really trying to eke out the last percentages of muscle growth, might be something to play with. But like all things, probably more studies are going to be needed in that. So one of the other presentations was from my buddy, Dr. Jonathan Mike. I like big recovery and I cannot lie. Sports supplements you can't deny. And it was a good, I think, overall review of some of the supplements that can help with recovery. Creatine, obviously protein, some of the basics ones, potentially fish oil. And one of the other ones he had on there that I'll have to go back and look at some of the data again was curcumin or turmeric. And I've used it kind of off and on, but I have this weird thing where if you need to put it in a phytosome or it has such poor bioavailability, I always wonder if that's for a good reason or not. And again, I know that's a naturalistic fallacy, and that doesn't automatically mean that something is bad. I understand that. But the data I've seen on it is kind of mixed. But based on his talk, I'm going to try to go back and look at some of that data again. And I believe he's working on a review paper for ISSN, so keep your eyes peeled for that. As a side note, I had made a note here that I talked to some of the people at the AstraReal booth about astaxanthine, and I've used it in the past potentially to reduce the risk of sunburn. So I'm very light complected. Generally, most of my life I've always burned very easily in the sun. I do kind of sort of get tan, but it takes a long time and very gradual exposure. And over the years, the things that seem to have helped the most are red light. So I have a red light panel I've used off and on for 3 years, which is photobiomodulation. And then higher dose of astaxanthine. I would typically take 10 to 15 milligrams per day for about a week or two before I would go on a kiteboarding trip. And still, I'm not going out there, just buck naked kiteboarding and going, ooh, I took astaxanthine, I'm not going to get sunburnt, because that's a really stupid idea. I would generally still wear UV guard, wear sunglasses, etc. But if you're outside in the sun that much, I did find that just the indifferent exposure, when I'm not out in the water or have my shirt off, pumping up the kite, etc., I didn't appear to burn nearly as easy. And I've tried that experiment off and on, going back probably 5 years now. And so I was just asking them about it, and they said it's anecdotal. There isn't really hardly any data that's been published on it, at least that I can find. Maybe I'll poke around again. But they said they've used up to 20 grams per day, and they've heard from other clients similar effects also. So again, not necessarily a recommendation, but if you're looking for things that may help in that area, something to keep your eyes out on. We'll go through some of the last ones here relatively fast. Again, there was lots and lots of presentations, so there's no way I'm going to be able to cover all of them. My good friend Dr. Lonnie Lowry gave a great talk on polyphenols as potential ergogenic and body composition modulators. This is especially talking about the different compounds that are in coffee. So coffee, as you know, is, as Dr. Lonnie says, more than liquid caffeine. It has other compounds in it that appear to have beneficial effects on physiology. There's some really good data on coffee reducing risk of Parkinson's, potentially diabetes, and other issues. So if people are listening and they're doing studies on coffee as an ergogenic, having a control group as decaf and even a control group as just warm water might be useful, because we know that caffeine is going to be the main thing for ergogenic performance, but other compounds in there will have other effects too. So I know Dr. Lonnie and other people are working on a review about coffee for the ISSN journal also. And it was just great to see him, hang out with him again. You can listen to a lot of past episodes that he was on Iron Radio. Unfortunately, he had to drop off Iron Radio for the time being because of new job requirements. But always fun to see him hang out. Went to the bars one night and just generally had lots of fun. Got to listen to all the new papers and everything he's been reading too. So always great to catch up with him. Next talk was the latest on nutritional ergogenic aids. This was on citrulline and resistance exercise performance. This is from Dr. Adam Gonzalez. So citrulline is in most of your kind of vasodilation or sort of pump products. There's two main forms. You'll see one as citrulline malate. So they take the citrulline molecule and they attach it to malate. The other one is just straight up L-citrulline itself. So L-citrulline is primarily found in watermelon, although you would need to eat a ton of watermelon to get high amounts of L-citrulline, and it's primarily in the rind, which is probably not the part that you are going to eat. L-citrulline by itself is probably the main ingredient. There hasn't really been a study done yet on citrulline versus malate. So we don't really know if citrulline malate versus citrulline, if there's a huge difference between those two. So if you're a graduate student kind of looking for a cool study to do, maybe comparing the effects of high-dose citrulline to high-dose malate, see if there's any difference there. For reference, depending upon the ratio that's used in the supplement, citrulline malate could be a 1-to-1 ratio, which would mean if you've got an 8-gram dose of citrulline malate, a 1-to-1 ratio, 4 grams would be L-citrulline, 4 grams would be malate. There is also a 2-to-1 ratio that's used, so that would be 5.3 grams of citrulline and 2.7 grams of malate. In all honesty, a lot of times it probably depends upon the price point of the supplement and what's going to be cheaper. Can't really tell from looking at the label. A lot of times they'll just list it as citrulline malate. Now, the reason for this is that citrulline is participating in the pathways that can help with vasodilation. Usually you think of vasodilation, the supplement in the past has always used is L-arginine. There's data, this is pretty old data, 15 years ago now, that the dose of L-arginine you need to see a vasodilation effect is in 10 to 12 grams, I think. And most people had massive GI issues at that point. So the supplement industry has always been trying to find, are there other ways around it? So the other end of these pathways would be kind of your nitrite, nitrate. Dr. Andy Beetroot gave a great talk on nitrates. You can follow him on Instagram for some great stuff. The takeaway of his talk was, nitrates appear to be beneficial for aerobic performance and can probably increase performance within the single digits, which for higher level athletes, that's pretty significant. Downside is you're going to need a pretty high level of nitrates in order to do that. And then a side note, this is also from a talk, I'm blanking on the guy who did it when I presented at the ISSN conference last fall. As a reminder, again, these are things that I assume everybody knows, but realize unless you're, knee deep into your eyeballs in this space, you probably wouldn't know. If you're using mouthwash and trying to use any nitrate-based product, it's not going to work very good. So the nitrates, ironically, to be converted, need to be sort of recycled through the enzymes in the mouth and the saliva. And when you use mouthwash, you get rid of all the little critters in there that are converting that. And you'll see this in studies that look at nitrates. They'll say, subjects were instructed, not to use any mouthwash. I remember talking to my buddy, Dr. Eric Trexler, about this, and he was like super paranoid because I believe he does study on nitrates, that the subjects would use mouthwash and would just completely obliterate all of his PhD work. So if you're using pump sort of products that have nitrate in them and mouthwash, try not using mouthwash. And again, this doesn't have anything to do with holding the nitrates or the pre-workout or anything in your mouth. It's just how it's sort of recycled through the body and through the fluids. So back to the talk on L-citrulline. The different forms, L-citrulline versus L-citrulline malate, or I should say just citrulline malate. So does citrulline actually increase blood flow? Most of the studies have probably been underdosed. 4 studies he presented showed not really any result. They did show some performance data, though, that at a high enough dose, a citrulline malate at 8 grams did show some increase in the number of reps that were performed to failure. And this is kind of consistent with the data on L-citrulline. You will see some data that does show performance increase, but not all of it agrees with each other. And in terms of blood flow, from what I've seen, most of the data is pretty mixed. The takeaway there is that it's probably underdosed. Now, surprisingly, there's not many studies that have used a high dose. So they were hypothesizing that maybe 10 to 15 grams per day of L-citrulline malate, or even as high as maybe 10 grams of just L-citrulline might be beneficial. They're doing, he said, an 8-gram dose study right now. So hopefully we'll have more data on that coming up in the future. But right now, most of the data is probably underdosed. They did a study that'll be coming out very soon, 7 days of using watermelon juice, because it has 2.2 grams of L-citrulline in it. Did 5 sets to failure. They looked at some NIRS data. So NIRS is like the commercial grade device would be like a Moxie device. You can look at local muscle oxygenation effects. And they didn't really see much of an effect in that group. So there was a meta-analysis that was done, and I believe the effect was positive, but it was very small. So effect size was 0.2. Takeaway of all of that stuff, L-citrulline is still pretty interesting, might be beneficial, but are you getting L-citrulline itself, or are you getting L-citrulline malate? Those are different compounds, and a lot of it may be underdosed as a supplement. So one of the other talks I found that was really, really interesting was from Dr. Marcus Baumann. He's working at IHMC, so Institute of Human and Machine Cognition in Florida. And what I really liked about his talk was it's kind of a combination of using machine learning and looking at just a whole host of data and different ways we can potentially make sense out of it. Some key takeaways from his talk is that physiology is a demand-based system. Like we said before with training, you have to place a demand on the system in order to get a response. The response to uniform demand is not uniform, meaning we see this in training studies. We have everybody do the exact same training, and we see the data plot. One of them, I remember Dr. Stu Phillips presented this. Oh man, it's 2008 ISSN, I think in Seattle, where he showed responses to a hypertrophy training program. And most of the people, in terms of lean body mass, were kind of right around the middle. There's still some variation there, which you would expect. 2 people were like 2 standard deviations above everybody else. And then one poor bastard technically lost lean body mass during the study. And so that always struck me as, if you look at the spread of data, like most people kind of got what they expected as a result. One poor bastard got worse, right? So you can imagine, I think it was a 12-week study, doing all that work for 12 weeks, and you technically went backwards. And then 2 people got these just astronomical results from it. Now, further research would say maybe those are extreme responders. Maybe it wasn't the right program for the poor bastard. Maybe it was sleep. Maybe it was nutrition. There's a lot of other things that it could be. But the takeaway is that even when we place a uniform demand on human subjects and we try to control for everything as best that we can, the output or the adaptation of that from a person to person is definitely not uniform, right? And everybody's seen this where you get a few freaks that just go to the gym and do like the stupidest stuff you've ever seen, and they get better, right? Which is also probably why following programs from elite level athletes is probably not the best idea unless you're an elite level athlete, right? You probably want to look at what do they actually do to get there. And he also mentioned that it's complex. And yes, we're trying to understand these things, but it's going to take a bunch of time. Something I thought was really interesting was when they were looking at muscle hypertrophy. One of the theories they had was these non-responders, or people that don't respond as well to changes in adding lean body mass, maybe they have some hyperinflammation at the muscle level. So not necessarily at the overall level, not necessarily at like CRP, but at the muscle itself. These people who are not responding as well, do they have inflammation that's just kind of awry at the muscle level? Now, again, their theory was that inflammation is playing a role in some of those people. They did work out some studies where they were doing training like 3 days a week of like a high, low, high, or a very high, high, high. And the high, low, high, they had an 88% positive result. The 3 days a week of just high load training, they only saw a 43% had a positive result. So I thought that was super interesting. Now, again, I don't have any data on, I'd have to look at what population that was. But this matches anecdotally a lot of data we've seen throughout time. I know my buddy Cal Dietz has published some of this. You can go all the way back to Charlie Francis's training system, like high-low methods, that most people, yeah, you need to stimulate the system, but you can't stimulate it balls out every single day, right? And sort of the training template that I've used for, God, I don't know how many people now, and it's kind of my starting point. It's like Monday, Wednesday, Friday, do some type of lifting. Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, do some cardio stuff. Depending on your goals, depending on what you're doing, Monday, Wednesday, Friday may vary. But even at the highest level, I found that only really 1 or 2 of those days can you go really, really hard with either high intensity or really high volume of that. So then they were looking at another study, which was Kathleen Levin, 2021, using a high-low model or high-low-high model and responders. And they used the drug metformin. What they found was metformin blunted some of the effects of exercise. Now, this is highly debatable. I think there's another study that also used metformin that did show a blunting of exercise effects, but if I remember right, it was relatively mild. They also presented some information on recovery from joint replacement. So they took muscle tissue samples, and they took some muscle that was removed surgically, and were doing different analyses on it. And they found that the more inflamed tissue appeared to be more catabolic. And the takeaway there was that there may be differences at the muscle level, and the blood level might be perfectly fine. So again, if I remember right, they're still analyzing this data. And so blood work is definitely useful, 100%. We know that if your blood work is just a floating trash bin fire, by all means, work with your doc, get that fixed up. However, there might be more tests. Maybe we could look at the blood level in the future to get a wrap our heads around this. But the muscle level itself might be different than what we see actually in blood levels itself. I also talked about there may be some decreased capitalization that may lead to anabolic resistance. This matches, if you read a lot of the old Soviet literature, of just increasing blood flow to areas, trying to maximize that both for recovery and potentially better performance gains. They would report that was a main thing that they would do in some of their training. So this would provide some data that people who have more anabolic resistance, where the muscle is not wanting to increase in size as much, may have a decreased amount of capitalization to it. So it's literally getting less blood flow. So again, really, I thought just a really amazing talk. They're using a lot of just genetic testing, machine learning, AI, all sorts of stuff to try to get at some of these very, very difficult problems. And that's my conclusion. There was a whole bunch of other talks too that were great. As I mentioned, it was wonderful to see so many people there again. Got to hang out. Was in nice, sunny, and very hot and humid Florida. So if you get the chance to go to the ISSN conference, I would highly recommend it. It will be in June next year. Same location, Fort Lauderdale Beach, Florida. It'll be the 20th annual ISSN conference. Usually the fees to go to it are not outrageously expensive either. Everyone there is super nice. Again, I'd even mention that they had, I think, almost a record number of posters there too. Some students were doing posters, undergrad, masters, PhDs. So just a ton of information, great people. I would highly recommend it. Hopefully you've enjoyed this chat about all the latest updates from the ISSN. I'll do my best to put as many of the studies as I can below. Some of the stuff we've talked about was only presented at the meeting, is not actually even published yet. That is a benefit of going to these meetings, is you get like literally the latest information many times before it is even in print. And as always, this was brought to you by the Flex Diet certification. So if you enjoy nutrition and recovery, check out the Flex Diet. Go to flexdiet.com, FLEXDIET.com. It'll have all the information. You can get on the wait list for the next time that it opens. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. If you had a specific question about something here, I will do my best to answer it. Just put a note on the old social media. Once this is up, we'll post it on Facebook and Instagram. So just put a note down there below. I'll do my best to get back to you and answer that. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a review. Anything pro or con, whatever stars you think is appropriate. And if there's someone you think could benefit from this bleeding edge information, please pass it along to them. Thank you so much for listening. Really appreciate it. Talk to you all next week.
You know, I don't think this show is suitable for children.
I don't think this show is suitable for anybody.